The morning Frederick Sheridan rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, 3 different men at the feed store warned him about the Vaughn widow before he had even dismounted his horse. He had not been looking for trouble. He had not been looking for much of anything, if he was being honest with himself, just work, maybe a decent meal that did not come from a tin can, and a place to rest his bones for a few weeks before moving on. That was how he had lived the past 4 years, drifting from one cattle town to the next, picking up ranch work wherever a foreman would have him, and leaving before anyone could form the habit of expecting him around. It was a tidy kind of life, if a lonely one, and Frederick Sheridan had made his peace with it somewhere between Abilene and Dodge City. He was 34 years old. He had dark hair that curled at the collar when he went too long without a haircut, which was often, and a jaw that needed a razor's attention roughly twice a week, which it also rarely received. He was not a particularly handsome man by any theatrical standard, but there was a steadiness to his gray eyes and a quiet competence in the way he moved through the world that women tended to notice and men tended to respect, even when they did not quite know why. The 3 men at the feed store, a heavy-set grain merchant, a young cowboy barely old enough to shave, and an older fellow with a white mustache who turned out to be the town barber. Each delivered their warnings with the particular relish of people who had been sitting on a good piece of gossip and were delighted to finally unload it on a fresh audience. The grain merchant went first. He said that the Vaughn place was a working ranch about 6 miles north of town, sitting on prime Sumner County land along the Kaskaskia River, and that the widow who ran it, one Henrietta Vaughn, had been turning away hired hands at a rate that bordered on the supernatural. 3 men in the past 2 months, and not one of them had lasted through a full week. The young cowboy added with some enthusiasm that it was not Henrietta herself who was the problem. By all accounts, she was a decent woman who paid fair wages and kept a clean bunkhouse. The problem was her sons. There were 4 of them. The eldest, Caleb, was 26 and had the temperament of a thundercloud. Next came Elias, 24, who was quieter but arguably more dangerous on account of how you could never tell what he was thinking. Then there was Silas, 21, who had his father's build and his grandfather's stubbornness. And finally, at the tail end of the family, there was Thomas, who was 9 years old and had apparently inherited every drop of sweetness that his brothers had collectively failed to absorb. The barber tied it all up neatly. He said that the Vaughn boys, the grown ones, anyway, had decided some time ago that their mother did not need a man on her property, and had taken it upon themselves to ensure that point was communicated clearly to any man who came looking for work. The last hired hand, a fellow from Wichita, had ridden away with a black eye and a strong conviction that he had chosen the wrong employer. The one before him had arrived at the feed store to return supplies he'd already purchased and announced that he was going back to Missouri and had never been happier about a decision in his life. Frederick listened to all 3 accounts with the patience of a man who had nothing pressing to do, thanked each man for his time, and then inquired about the road north. He was not reckless. He had not gotten to 34 in the territory by being reckless. But a working ranch with fair wages and a decent bunkhouse sounded considerably better than another month of itinerant work, and he had learned long ago that the best stories about a place were rarely the complete truth. People embellished. People projected. And sometimes what looked like a wall of hostile sons was actually just a family that had been hurt badly and had not yet figured out how to stop protecting themselves. Besides, he needed the work. The winter had been hard on his savings. The road north was exactly as described, a rutted track through rolling grassland that Kansas did beautifully in late April, the buffalo grass just beginning to green up after the cold, meadowlarks stitching their songs through the clear morning air. Frederick rode at an easy pace and led his horse, a brown gelding named Canteen on account of his ability to go long distances between water, set the rhythm. He smelled the Vaughn ranch before he saw it. Wood smoke first, then the particular combination of horse and hay and worked earth that meant a place had been running long enough to accumulate a history. Then the fence line appeared, solid cedar posts and 3 strands of wire, well maintained. Then a windmill turning slow in the light breeze. Then the house itself, a 2-story frame structure painted white, with a wide porch running the full length of the front, and a kitchen garden to one side that showed signs of recent turning. Behind it, a proper barn, a smaller outbuilding that was likely the bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and a corral with 4 horses moving in it with the slow, deliberate comfort of animals that were well fed and knew it. It was, Frederick thought, a genuinely fine piece of property. Someone had put a great deal of care into this place over a long time. He was still 30 yards from the gate when the front door opened, and a woman stepped onto the porch. Henrietta Vaughn was 40 years old, though she would not have appeared so to anyone who had not been told. She was tall for a woman of her era, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid that had several strands escaping it in the particular way of hair that had started the day neat and been subsequently worn by hours of hard work. She had brown eyes that caught the light with a warmth that her expression, which was currently carefully neutral, did not quite succeed in hiding. Her dress was plain dark blue cotton, work-worn but clean, and her hands, when she folded them in front of her on the porch railing, were the hands of someone who had never once in her life been afraid of labor. She did not say anything as Frederick rode up to the gate. She simply looked at him with those brown eyes and waited. He pulled Canteen to a stop and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am. I'm looking for the Vaughn place." "You found it," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, not deep but with a kind of gravity to it as though each word had been measured before being released. "My name's Frederick Sheridan. I heard in town you might be in need of hired hands." For a moment she studied him the way a person studies a piece of ground before deciding whether it is safe to walk on. "I have been in need of hired hands for 2 months, she said. "Whether I will continue to be in need of them depends on certain things." "What kind of things?" "Whether the man I hire has good sense, good work habits, and the ability to get along with a household that has its own particular ways." She paused. "And whether he can ride, rope, and read a fence line." "I can do all 3, Frederick said. "I've worked cattle from here to the Colorado Territory. References if you need them." She seemed to consider something for a moment, some internal calculation he could not see. Then she said, "You will have met people in town who told you things about this property. I met a few. Then you know about my sons. I heard something along those lines. And you came anyway." "The wages sounded fair," he said, which was true, and also was not the whole truth, which was that something in the straightforward description of a woman running a working ranch alone had struck him as a kind of courage he found difficult to ride away from. The corner of her mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "The wages are fair," she confirmed. "The bunkhouse is clean and I run a proper table. You will be expected to work from before sunup, and you will be treated with respect as long as you earn it." She came down one step from the porch. "But I will not pretend to you that everything here is simple. My sons are protective. They have reasons for it that are their own, and I will not apologize for them even though I may sometimes wish they expressed their feelings with slightly less enthusiasm." "That sounds like an honest account," Frederick said. "I try to be honest," she said. "It saves time in the long run." She came down the remaining steps and walked to the gate with the unhurried confidence of a woman on her own land. She unlatched it and pushed it open. "Ride in, Mr. Sheridan. I will show you where to put your horse, and then we will talk wages." He rode Canteen through the gate and dismounted, and that was how it started. Not with drama, not with any particular ceremony, just a woman and a man standing in a Kansas spring morning, making a practical arrangement that neither of them yet understood was going to change everything. Caleb Vaughn appeared within the hour, as though he had some internal mechanism that alerted him to the presence of a new hired hand on the property. He was a large young man, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had been doing heavy outdoor work since he was old enough to hold a tool, with his mother's auburn coloring expressed in darker, more angular form, and eyes that were a shade of brown so deep they read as nearly black from more than a few feet away. He came into the barn where Frederick was settling canteen in a stall and stood in the doorway with his arms folded and the particular stance of a man who has decided something before any conversation has taken place. "Mama tell you to bring your horse in here," he said. "She did," Frederick said pleasantly, forking hay into the stall. "How long you planning to stay?" "That depends on the work and whether your mother's satisfied with mine." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching with the specific quality of watchfulness that is less about observation and more about the transmission of a message. "There were 3 men before you. None of them made it past a week." "So I heard," Frederick said. He did not stop working. He had found over the years that continuing to work while being studied was one of the more effective things you could do in a tense situation, because it communicated that you were not going to change your behavior based on the study. "This ranch ran fine before you got here," Caleb said. "It will run fine after." "I expect that's true," Frederick agreed. Caleb seemed to have been prepared for resistance, and Frederick's simple agreement appeared to momentarily disconcert him. He recalibrated. "We don't need outside men coming in here trying to," he stopped. "This is our mother's place. Our father built it, and we don't need someone coming and thinking they can. I'm here to work cattle and mend fences," Frederick said, not unkindly. He looked up from the hay fork and met Caleb's nearly black eyes directly. "That's all." The young man stared at him for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms, though he didn't exactly relax. "Good," he said, and walked away. Elias materialized later that afternoon, while Frederick was repairing a section of pasture fence where 3 posts had rotted and needed to be dug out and replaced. Elias was quieter than his brother, as had been reported. He came up alongside and stood watching the work with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and his hat tipped slightly forward over his forehead, and Frederick became aware of him only gradually, the way you become aware of weather. "You know what you're doing with those posts," Elias said eventually. It was stated flatly, without warmth, but also without the overt hostility of his brother. "I've replaced enough of them," Frederick said. "Ground's hard here. Caliche layer about 8 inches down. You have to go at an angle." I noticed. Frederick had, in fact, already adjusted his approach after hitting the caliche layer and spending 20 minutes figuring out the best way around it. He gestured at the post hole he had successfully dug. "This work," Elias looked at it. "It'll do," he said, which Frederick sensed was a significant concession. Silas he encountered at supper that evening, when Henrietta called the hands to the kitchen table. Frederick was currently the only hand, which made the table feel both more welcoming and more exposed. Silas came in from the barn, dropped into his chair with the particular eloquence of a young man communicating displeasure through posture alone, and spent the meal regarding Frederick with the kind of focused dissatisfaction that felt almost performative, as though he was working through his feelings about the situation in real time. Henrietta served beef stew and cornbread and fresh butter, and a peach preserves that Frederick thought, privately, was the best thing he had eaten in roughly 8 months. She moved through the kitchen with the easy authority of someone in complete command of her domain, directing conversation with light questions and listening with genuine interest to the answers. She asked Frederick where he was from. He told her Indiana originally, though that felt like a different life now. She asked what had brought him west. He said the same thing that brought most people west, the sense that there was more room out here for a person to become whatever they were meant to become. She looked at him when he said that, a quick, considering look that she did not quite disguise. "And have you," she asked, "become what you were meant to become?" "Working on it," he said. Thomas arrived at the supper table approximately 3 minutes late, having apparently been required to wash his hands twice on account of a disagreement with a muddy patch near the water pump, and he dropped into the chair beside Frederick with the absolute unself-conscious confidence of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to be cautious of strangers. "Are you the new hired man?" Thomas asked. "I am," Frederick said. "What's your name?" "Frederick Sheridan." Thomas considered this with the solemnity of someone evaluating important information. "I'm Thomas. The other ones that came, the hired men, they didn't stay very long. Caleb scared off 2 of them and Silas scared off the other one." He delivered this information with complete neutrality, as though reporting weather conditions. "Thomas," Henrietta said, with a patient tone that suggested this was not the first time the boy had said things that were technically accurate but diplomatically challenging. "It's true," Thomas said, unperturbed. "It may be true," she said, "but it is not polite dinner conversation." Thomas seemed to genuinely consider whether he agreed with this distinction, and then shrugged with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has learned to pick his battles. He turned back to Frederick. "Do you know how to play checkers?" he asked. "I do," Frederick said. "Good," said Thomas, "because nobody here will play with me anymore. Caleb says I cheat, but I don't. I just remember where all the pieces have been." Frederick caught Henrietta's eye across the table and saw that she was suppressing something that, given adequate opportunity, might have developed into a real laugh. He felt something warm move through him at the sight of it, unexpected and unwelcome in its timing, and he looked back down at his stew and told himself it was just the peach preserves making him sentimental. The first 2 weeks on the Vaughn ranch were hard work, good work, the kind that left you with an honest tiredness at the end of the day and the satisfying knowledge that the land looked better for what you had done to it. Frederick repaired the entire eastern fence line, rebuilt the gate hinges on the main corral, helped Henrietta and Elias work the spring cattle through for branding and doctoring, and found and fixed a slow leak in the water trough that had apparently been losing about 5 gallons a day for the better part of a winter. Caleb remained wary and somewhat hostile, though it was the hostility of a man maintaining a position rather than one acting on a genuine conviction. Every morning he watched what Frederick did, and every afternoon Frederick caught him watching still, and the watching had begun to contain something that was not approval but was adjacent to it. Elias thawed by degrees, the way deep winter ground thaws slowly from the outside in, with long stretches where nothing appeared to be changing at all. He started including Frederick in conversations about the ranch work, nothing personal, purely practical, but it was a kind of inclusion. Silas remained stubbornly resistant, mostly through the continuation of the heavy-lidded dissatisfaction he had displayed at that first supper. He did not interfere with Frederick's work, but he also made no particular effort to communicate anything beyond the bare minimum. Frederick left him alone with his feelings and trusted that something would eventually shift. Thomas was simply himself, enthusiastic, honest, and entirely free of the complications his brothers had accumulated. He appeared at the bunkhouse door on the 3rd evening carrying a checkerboard and a look of determination, and Frederick spent an hour playing checkers with him, and discovered that Thomas's method of remembering where all the pieces had been was in fact quite close to a genuine strategic system, and told him so. The child's face lit up with a pleasure so pure it was almost painful to look at. He had been on the property 11 days when the moment happened that would, in retrospect, seem like the true beginning of things, though he did not know it at the time. He had been working in the near pasture since early morning, and the afternoon had gone hot in the particular way of Kansas in May, where the sun seems to find some personal grievance with the ground and addresses it with sustained intensity. He had come back to the barn to check on Canteen, who had been favoring his right foreleg slightly that morning, when he heard a sound from behind the barn that did not fit, a kind of rhythmic thudding that resolved, as he came around the corner, into the image of Henrietta Vaughn trying to split a section of wood that had a knot in it that was apparently resisting her with considerable conviction. She had taken off her outer dress jacket and rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, and she was swinging the splitting maul with the practiced force of someone who had done this many times. But the knotted section was defeating her, bouncing the maul back every time and apparently getting more stubborn with each attempt. Her braid had come entirely undone on one side and her hair was sweat-dark at the temples, and she was making a specific sound under her breath that Frederick recognized, from his own experience with difficult wood, as the sound of someone who has moved past frustration into a kind of grim, pure determination. "Can I try?" he said. She turned, and for a half-second there was something in her eyes that was not quite embarrassment and not quite surprise but contained elements of both. Then her chin went up slightly. "Be my guest," she said, and handed him the maul with a dignity that was entirely genuine. He took the maul, studied the knot, turned the log section to a slightly different angle and split it on the first swing. Henrietta looked at the two halves on the ground. Then she looked at him. "How did you know to angle it that way?" "My father had a woodlot in Indiana. He had an opinion about knots." Frederick set the next section up. He said, "A knot's not an enemy. It's just a place that grew differently. You have to work with the direction it grew, not against it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father sounds like a thoughtful man." "He was," Frederick said. "He died the winter after I left home. I've regretted going so long without going back to see him." He split the next section and the next. "You don't have to do this yourself, you know. Any of the boys could do it." "Caleb's in town," she said. "Elias and Silas are moving the back pasture cattle. And I am perfectly capable of splitting wood." "I didn't suggest otherwise," he said mildly. She picked up half a split section and set it aside. "I don't enjoy being helped when I haven't asked for it," she said, in a tone that was more honest than combative. "I've spent the past 3 years managing this place on my own, and before that I managed half of it while my husband was sick, and before that I managed a third of it while he managed the rest. I know how to do things." "That's clear," he said. "But," she added after a pause, "it was kind of you to offer, and the angle was useful information." That was the closest she came, in those early weeks, to warmth directed specifically at him. He stored it away with more care than he intended. The nature of ranch work meant that they often found themselves in the same place at the same time, which is to say that proximity was a condition of the job. He held posts while she strung wire. He helped her calculate the weight of the cattle they would send to market in the fall, and whether the price they had been quoted by the buyer in town was fair, which it was not, and she listened to his counterargument with serious attention, and said she would write to 2 other buyers. She saddled a horse she was not familiar with one morning, and he pointed out, without making a performance of it, that the horse was cinching down on its back end and could buck if pushed, and she adjusted the saddle without comment and without embarrassment. She was the most competent person he had met in recent memory. She was also, he noticed slowly and then all at once, the most interesting, in the specific way of a person who has lived fully and thought hard about what they have experienced and carries the result of that thinking in a kind of alert, contained intelligence that expressed itself mostly in the quality of her attention. She listened as though what you said actually mattered. She thought before she spoke. When she was wrong, which he witnessed once, about the best route to drive a small group of cattle to the water source on the eastern edge of the property, she acknowledged it simply, said she had not considered the creek crossing condition this late in the season, and adjusted. There was no performance of humility and no defensiveness, just the straightforward willingness to update her view in light of better information. He found himself thinking about her during the quiet hours of the evening in the bunkhouse. Then he found himself not letting himself think about her, with the particular discipline of a man who has identified a feeling as inconvenient and is attempting to discourage it. Then he found himself failing at that discipline, which was the stage at which he recognized that the situation had progressed further than was comfortable. She was his employer. She was a widow with a family and a working ranch and 4 sons, 3 of whom were actively invested in ensuring that no man developed any kind of personal attachment to their mother. He was a drifting ranch hand with a gelding, a bedroll, and no particular fixed address. The arithmetic of this was not complicated. He had been on the property for 3 weeks and 2 days when Caleb Vaughn made his intentions fully explicit. Frederick had ridden out to check a section of fence on the property's north boundary and was on his way back in the late afternoon when he heard a horse behind him and turned to find Caleb coming up fast. Not alarming fast, but with enough intent in his pace to signal that this was not a casual coincidence. "I'll ride in with you," Caleb said, pulling alongside. It was not quite a question. "Suit yourself," Frederick said. They rode in silence for a while. Kansas was doing something spectacular with the late afternoon light, painting the grass in golds and coppers that made the whole landscape look like it was lit from underneath. Frederick focused on the view and let the silence be what it was. "You're not like the others," Caleb said eventually. "How do you mean?" "The other ones, they either pushed back on us or they were too scared to function. You just," he made a gesture that was difficult to interpret on horseback, "work, like we're not even there." "I'm aware you're there," Frederick said. "I just don't have anything to prove to you." Caleb appeared to turn this over. "My father died 3 years ago, February of 1879, pneumonia." He said it without particular softness, the way men of that era often reported painful things as fact cleanly, without framing that might leave an opening for vulnerability. "He built that ranch from nothing, from a claim he filed in 1861 when this land was barely settled. He worked 20 years on it." "That's a legacy," Frederick said. "It is," Caleb agreed. "And my mother runs it now as well as he did, and possibly better in some respects because she has a stronger head for the books. She doesn't need anything from anyone that she hasn't asked for." "I understand that," Frederick said. "I'm not sure you do," Caleb said, and now there was something in his voice that was less hostility and more something rawer and more specific. "Every man who comes to this property, there have been more than just the hired hands. They look at a widow with a good piece of land and they see an opportunity. And she works so hard. She has given everything she has to that place and to us, and she doesn't," he started again. "She doesn't deserve to have some man come in and take what she's built." Frederick let the words settle. Then he said carefully, "I came to work cattle and earn wages. Whatever you're worried I might be thinking beyond that, I am not your father's replacement, and I am not here to take what your family built. That's all I can tell you, and I understand if it's not enough." Caleb rode beside him for another quarter-mile. "It's not enough," he said finally. But there was a different quality to it, less like a threat and more like a man being honest about where his line was. "But I'll admit you haven't given me a specific reason to run you off yet." "I appreciate that," Frederick said. And he meant it. It was Elias who gave Frederick the fuller picture of the situation, unexpectedly, one evening about a week later. They were replacing boards in the barn floor that had gone punky with rot, working by lamplight as the evening came on, and Elias had settled into the companionable silence that comes with two people doing physical work side by side, and then, without particular preamble, started talking. "Mama had a brother who came out here 2 years after Papa died," Elias said, driving a nail with the efficient economy of a man who has driven a great many nails in his life. "He was real attentive. Rode out every week for a while. We all thought," he paused. "Well, what ended up happening was that he had debts we didn't know about, and he was in serious conversation with the man who holds the note on the Caldwell Bank about whether Mama might be persuaded to sign over a portion of the eastern acreage against those debts. He hadn't said anything about it to Mama. He was building toward it." Frederick sat back on his heels. "What happened?" "Caleb found out through a man he knew in town. We told Mama. She told her brother to leave and not come back, and she's never spoken of him since." Elias drove another nail. "He was her family. She trusted him, and he was looking at this place like it was something to solve his problems with." He did not look up from his work. "So when men come around now, any men, for any reason, we are careful." "That's reasonable," Frederick said. "Caleb is the most careful, sometimes too careful." Elias finally looked up. "But he's not wrong that there have been men who saw what she has and wanted it." "I won't pretend I don't see what she has," Frederick said, because he was a man who had been trying to be straightforward in all things for the past several years and wasn't going to stop now. She has one of the finest properties I've seen in 4 years of working this territory, and she runs it with more skill than most men I've worked for. What I will tell you is that I am not interested in the land. I'm not interested in anything except earning my wages honestly, and I have enough respect for your mother that I won't pretend otherwise. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and went back to driving nails. The following Sunday, Henrietta sent the older boys to Caldwell for supplies and stayed home with Thomas, and as it turned out, Frederick, who had been planning to spend the day cleaning and oiling tack in the barn. It was the first time since his arrival that they were in any real sense alone on the property, and both of them seemed to be aware of it in a way that was not uncomfortable but was present, like a change in air pressure. Thomas spent the morning demanding that Frederick teach him how to properly rope a fence post, a lesson that consumed considerable rope, produced considerable laughter from the boy, and ended with Thomas successfully catching the post on his 4th attempt, and whooping with a joy so outsized and sincere that even Henrietta, watching from the porch with her morning coffee, shook her head and smiled. And that smile, directed at her son's joy, not at Frederick at all, entirely unguarded and warm and purely itself, hit Frederick somewhere in the chest with the force of a revelation. He stood there holding the rope while Thomas danced around the post, and he thought, this is why people stay places. Not the land, not the wages. This collection of specific things that are true about one person and that you will never find in quite the same combination anywhere else in the world. He thought, I am in significant trouble. After the noon meal, which Henrietta made with the easy speed of someone who had been feeding large groups of people for the better part of 2 decades, Thomas fell asleep in the porch chair in the way of children who have spent all their energy and collapsed where they stood, and Frederick found himself sitting on the porch steps while Henrietta sat in the chair opposite, doing some mending, and the afternoon opened up around them with the generous unhurriedness of a Sunday. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Depending on what it is," she said. "How long have you been doing this alone?" She did not look up from her mending immediately. "Since February of '79. Though truthfully, Gerald, my husband, he was ill through most of '78, so closer to 4 years of the full weight of it. That's a long time." "It is," she said simply, "though I won't say I haven't had help. Caleb has worked himself half to death for this place. They all have." She glanced at Thomas, sleeping with the absolute abandon of the untroubled. "Even Thomas helps in the ways he can. Do you miss it?" Frederick asked, and then, because the question was not specific enough, having a partner in it, someone to share the weight of the decisions. She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he had crossed a line. Then she said, "I miss being known. The way you are known by a person who has watched you live for years. Gerald knew. He knew which problems I would lie awake over and which ones I would solve before morning. He knew that I find certain kinds of silence restorative and others unbearable. He knew that I grieve more quietly than most people expect." She paused. "I manage the ranch. I manage the accounts. I manage the boys to whatever extent that is possible. What I have not managed is finding a way to be not alone in the way that matters." She said it without self-pity, which made it considerably more affecting than self-pity would have been. Frederick looked out at the Kansas afternoon. "My mother told me once that loneliness is just love with nowhere to go," he said. "I thought it was a sad thing to say at the time. Now I think she was right, but it doesn't have to end there." Henrietta looked at him, a long, considering look that went somewhere and was not in a hurry about it. "No," she said at last, "it doesn't have to end there." Then Thomas stirred in his chair and said something indistinct about a horse, and they both laughed, and the moment moved into whatever came next. The following week was the hardest and the most revealing. It started with Sela's coming to the bunkhouse after supper on Monday evening and announcing, with the air of someone who has rehearsed this but is not entirely comfortable with the performance, that he had some things to say. Frederick sat on his bunk and gestured for the young man to come in, which he did, and then stood in the middle of the small room looking at his own boots for a moment before looking up. "You're doing something to this place," Silas said. "Working cattle and fixing fences," Frederick said patiently. "Not that." Silas crossed his arms, less in the challenging way of Caleb and more like he was trying to hold his own position together by force of contact. "Mama, she laughs more. She comes out to the porch in the evening and she sits and she seems easier, like she's put something down for a while." He said it as though it was an accusation, but the accusation did not entirely hold its shape. "And Thomas follows you around like a baby duck." "Thomas is a good kid," Frederick said. "He doesn't have—" Silas stopped. When he started again, his voice had dropped some of its defensive edge. "He was 2 when Papa started getting sick. He doesn't really remember him. He remembers what we've told him and what Mama's told him, but it's not the same." He looked at a point somewhere above Frederick's right shoulder. "I don't want him getting attached to someone who's going to leave." Frederick understood then what this conversation was actually about. Not about Silas protecting his mother, about Silas protecting his brother. "What would make you believe I wasn't planning to leave?" he asked. Silas blinked. It seemed he had not expected a direct engagement with the actual question. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Then we're in the same position," Frederick said, "because I can't prove something about the future. I can only show you what I do today and tomorrow and the day after." He met the young man's eyes. "But I will tell you this honestly. I have not felt settled on a piece of ground since I left Indiana 12 years ago. This," he paused, choosing the right words carefully, "this place feels different, for reasons I am not prepared to entirely examine yet." Silas stared at him for a long moment. Then he exhaled, a long, complicated exhale that seemed to carry more than just air. He unfolded his arms. "Thomas really does follow you around like a duck," he said. "I know," Frederick said. "I don't mind it." Something shifted in Silas's expression, something private and young and a little heartbroken in the way that 21-year-olds can be heartbroken about things they are not yet sure how to name. "He asked me last week if you were going to be here for his birthday," he said. "His birthday's in August." Frederick felt the weight of that simple fact settle on him. "When did you tell him?" "I didn't know what to tell him," Silas admitted. "Tell him I'll do my best," Frederick said. And he meant it the way a man means a thing when he has stopped pretending to himself that he has not already made a decision. The crisis came on a Thursday, which was not a day that had seemed to be building toward crisis. The morning had been ordinary. Frederick had ridden out at first light with Elias to check on a group of yearlings pastured in the far northwest corner of the property, and they had found 2 of them down with a sickness that Elias identified as blackleg with a calm, immediate certainty that Frederick respected. The young man knew his cattle. They spent the morning treating what could be treated, marking the animals that needed to be separated, and rode back to the main property with the kind of serious fatigue that comes not from physical labor but from the management of bad news. Henrietta met them at the gate and Elias reported the situation, and she listened with complete focus, asked 3 precise questions about which animals, what stage, and what treatment had been applied, and then said she needed to ride out and see for herself. She was saddling her horse when the rider came in from town. He was a well-dressed man, which was notable in itself. Not the working ranch kind of dressed, but the town kind, with a coat that fit well and boots that had been recently polished, and the general air of a man who considered his appearance to be a professional instrument. He introduced himself to Frederick, who was nearest the gate, as one George Albright, with business regarding the Vaughn property. Frederick showed him to the main house and went to tell Henrietta, who came back from the barn with a look on her face that told Frederick she recognized the name. "He's a buyer," she said quietly, "or says he is. He's been sending letters about the eastern acreage for about 8 months. "Do you want me to stay close?" she said, which was not what he had expected her to say. She caught the expression on his face and clarified, not quite looking at him. "I don't need you to say anything. I would prefer not to be alone in a room with that particular conversation." It turned out to be something considerably worse than a standard offer. George Albright, it emerged over the course of a tense 45 minutes in the Vaughn parlor, had in recent months purchased 3 notes of debt that had been held against the Vaughn property since its early years, small notes, forgotten or assumed paid, and was now presenting them together as a package that, if not settled, would allow him to make a claim against the Eastern Quarter section. Henrietta sat across from him with her hands in her lap and her face completely composed, and Frederick, sitting to one side as requested, watched her absorb this information with a quality of stillness he found both admirable and alarming. "I would like to see the documentation," she said. Albright produced it. Frederick leaned over to look, and what he saw made something cold and precise move through him. The documents were real. The amounts were real. But the interest that had been applied was, he looked more carefully, applied at a rate that was not stated in the original note language. It had been added. Mrs. Vaughn, he said, keeping his voice level, the interest calculation on the second note uses a rate that isn't specified in the original note. The note specifies simple interest, and this calculation is compound. Albright looked at Frederick for the first time with something other than dismissal. "And you are Frederick Sheridan. I work this property. This is a legal matter between myself and Mrs. Vaughn." "He's right," Henrietta said, and her voice was the clearest thing in the room. She had pulled the second note toward her and was reading it with the focused attention she gave everything. "The original language says simple interest at 4% annually. What you have calculated here is compounded quarterly. Those are not the same number." She looked up. "The amount you are claiming is incorrect by my calculation by approximately $43. Albright's expression underwent a small, controlled rearrangement. "There may be some, there is not some," Henrietta said quietly. "There is a specific number written in this document and a different number in your calculation, and I am not prepared to accept a claim based on a number that is not in the document." She folded her hands. "I will consult with an attorney in Caldwell about these notes. If the amounts are valid as corrected, I will settle them. If there are further irregularities, I will report them to the county recorder. I would like you to leave my property now." Albright left. He was not happy about it, but he left. When the sound of his horse had faded down the road, Caleb, who had arrived home from Caldwell sometime during the meeting and had apparently been standing in the hallway listening, came into the parlor with his jaw set and his hands in fists and said several things about George Albright that were colorful and, Frederick suspected, entirely accurate. Henrietta let him finish. Then she said, "We will handle this correctly, through the attorney and through the county recorder's office." She stood up. "Caleb, the eastern acreage is not going anywhere." "Because of him," Caleb said, and he was looking at Frederick when he said it, not with hostility, with something more complicated. "He caught the interest calculation." "He did," Henrietta agreed. Caleb looked at Frederick for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was quieter than his usual register and seemed to cost him something, "That was useful, thank you." Frederick nodded once and did not make anything of it. But Henrietta caught his eye over her oldest son's shoulder, and the look she gave him was warm and direct and entirely her own, and Frederick understood that something had shifted in the weight of the world between them. The attorney in Caldwell confirmed the calculation error. The notes were settled at their correct amount within 2 weeks, and the threat to the eastern acreage dissolved. George Albright did not return to the Vaughn property. It was in the wake of this that the thing between Frederick and Henrietta began to become something that could not entirely be managed by practical arrangements and careful distance. It happened in the way that true things happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small moments, each one ordinary on its own, each one adding something to the structure of what was being built between them. He held a lamp for her one night while she doctored a cut on Elia's forearm. Elia's had taken a barbed wire scratch that needed cleaning and bandaging, and she worked with the quick, gentle efficiency of a mother, and her hands near his hands holding the lamp were close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off them, and neither of them moved away. She brought coffee out to the barn one cold morning when he was working before dawn, and stayed to talk while he worked, leaning against a stall door with her coffee cup in both hands. And they talked about Indiana and about Kansas and about the particular kind of beauty that lives in flat land, which requires a different quality of attention than the beauty of mountains or oceans. And she said something about horizons that he thought about for the rest of the day. She came to find him one evening with a book she thought he might like, based on something he had mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier, which meant she had been remembering things he said in passing 3 weeks earlier, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with that information except receive the book and find himself reading it that night in the lamplight with a kind of feeling in his chest that had not been there before she arrived and was very much there now. And through all of this, Thomas continued to be Thomas, showing up at inconvenient and deeply convenient moments alike, asking Frederick to help him identify constellations, because Elias had said he was too young, but Frederick had said there was no such thing as too young for stars, and telling Frederick gravely, one afternoon, that he had decided that when he grew up he wanted to work a ranch and know how to play checkers and be able to split wood at a knot, and that he thought Frederick was a good example of how to be a person. Frederick had not been told something like that in a very long time. He sat with it for a while afterward, quietly, in the bunkhouse, and came to the conclusion that he was going to have to make some decisions about his life that he had been postponing for approximately 4 years. He had been on the Vaughn ranch for 7 weeks when he asked Henrietta to take a walk with him after supper. She came without hesitation, which told him something. They walked out toward the eastern fence line in the long summer evening, the light still golden at 8 o'clock, the meadowlarks doing their particular evening business, the smell of cut grass and warm earth rising around them. They walked without talking for a while, which was one of the things he had come to understand about her. She was perfectly comfortable in silence that was comfortable, and this one was. When they stopped at the edge of the pasture fence and looked out at the eastern acreage, the acreage she had just saved, the acreage her husband had built, the acreage her sons would inherit, he said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know I have thought about it carefully before I said it." She turned to look at him. Her hair was down that evening, for once. She had washed it earlier and it had dried into the loose waves that a braid kept controlled during the day, and in the evening light it was the color of autumn leaves and had the particular quality of things that are rarely seen and therefore remarkable when they are. "I have been here 7 weeks," he said, "and in 7 weeks I have not once had the thought that I want to be somewhere else. That is, for me, in the last 4 years, that is not a small thing." She said nothing yet, but her eyes were steady on his face. "I am not going to say anything I am not sure of," he said. "I am sure of this, that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in all my traveling, and that this land and this family and the particular way the sun goes down over this property have gotten into me in a way that doesn't feel temporary." He paused. "I am not asking for anything tonight. I thought you should know where I was, because it seemed dishonest to feel this way and not say so." Henrietta Vaughn looked at him for a long time. The evening moved around them. A nighthawk made its swooping passes overhead, and somewhere in the middle distance a coyote said something to nobody in particular, and the grass moved in the light breeze. "Frederick," she said, and the way she said his name like it had weight and was worth saying carefully did something to him. "I have been trying to be practical for 4 years. I have been very, very practical, about the cattle and the fences and the accounts and the boys and every single thing that needed to be managed." She looked down at the fence rail her hand was resting on. "And then you came and started being the kind of person you are, and being practical about it has been." She stopped. Looked back up. "It has been increasingly difficult," he said very quietly. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," she said. And then after a moment more quietly still, "No, it is not a bad thing." He did not kiss her then. It was not the moment for it. They were still finding the shape of what was between them, and he respected both her and the process too much to rush it. But he reached out and put his hand over hers on the fence rail, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stood there in the Kansas evening for a long time, looking at the land she had built and he had come to love. And the world felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely like enough. Caleb noticed the following morning. Frederick was not entirely sure how nothing visible had changed, but Caleb appeared at the corral before breakfast with that particular watchful quality magnified considerably, and he spent the morning in the way of a man working through a series of internal arguments. At noon, he appeared in the barn where Frederick was working and said, without introduction, "You have feelings for my mother." "That's between your mother and me," Frederick said. "This is my father's ranch," Caleb said, and his voice cracked on the word father just slightly, just enough. Frederick set down what he was doing and turned to face the young man fully. "I know it is," he said. "I know what your father built here and what it cost him and what it means to you. I would never do anything to disrespect that. But you," Caleb stopped. His jaw worked. "She has already given 30 years to this place. She deserves," he stopped again. "She deserves to be happy," Frederick said quietly. "Don't you think so?" Caleb stared at him. The stare contained a great many things: love for his mother, fear of loss, the specific grief of a son who has already lost one parent and cannot contemplate another kind of loss. And underneath all of that, Frederick could see it, the faintest beginning of a willingness to consider that the thing he was afraid of might not be what he thought it was. "If you hurt her," Caleb said finally, and his voice was very low, "I will make very certain you regret it." "I understand," Frederick said, "and I won't." Caleb held his gaze for another long moment. Then he nodded once very slightly and walked out. Elias sought Frederick out that same afternoon, which told him the brothers had talked. "Caleb told us," Elias said simply. "I figured. Silas is processing. I expect he is." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have watched you for 8 weeks. I have watched you work this land, and I have watched the way you are with Thomas and the way you listen to Mama when she talks, and he seemed to be working his way through something. Papa was a good man. He was. But he wasn't always. He had tempers, and he wasn't always patient, and sometimes Mama carried more than she should have." He paused. "You're patient. You're the most patient man I've seen in a long while." "I've had time to practice it," Frederick said. "She's worth it," Elias said, "just that. She's worth whatever patience it takes." "I know," Frederick said. Elias nodded. "Don't make me regret saying this," he said, and walked away. Silas came to the bunkhouse 2 nights later. Frederick was reading by lamplight and heard the knock and called the young man in, and Silas came in and stood in the middle of the room with an expression that was considerably more open than Frederick had yet seen on him. "I've been thinking," Silas said. "I imagined so," Frederick said. "Papa's been gone 3 years. And Mama, she's 40 years old, and she's been so alone, even with all of us here." He sat down on the edge of the other bunk, uninvited, but Frederick didn't object. "I've been so busy trying to protect what Papa built that I didn't." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She needs more than what we can give her. We're her sons. It's not the same." "No," Frederick said gently, "it's not. I'm not saying I'm happy about it," Silas said quickly. "I'm saying I understand it, and I'm saying," he seemed to be choosing words with the care of someone navigating unfamiliar ground, "I'm saying that I've been watching you, same as Elias, and I think you mean what you say. And I think that if anyone was going to, that if Mama was going to," he gave up on the sentence construction and simply said, "Don't leave, okay? Whatever else happens. Just don't be one of the ones that leaves." "That," said Frederick, "is exactly what I intend." Silas sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas is going to be insufferable about this. He's going to be absolutely convinced he arranged the whole thing." Frederick laughed, which he had not expected to do. "He might not be entirely wrong," he said. Silas almost smiled. It was a brief thing, a flash gone almost before it arrived, but it was there, and Frederick stored it away alongside the others. The summer moved forward the way Kansas summers do, with tremendous heat and the particular beauty of long days, and an urgency that comes from knowing how much has to be accomplished before the season turns. Frederick worked the Vaughn ranch with the same sustained attention he had brought to the first days, but there was something different now in how the work felt. It had weight. It had stakes. It had the specific quality of purpose that comes from caring about the outcome. He and Henrietta took other evening walks. They talked about everything and they talked about nothing, and both kinds of conversation mattered. She told him about growing up in Missouri, one of 6 children, and learning to manage accounts for her father's dry goods business by the age of 12, because she was clearly the most mathematically inclined of the lot, and how she had met Gerald Vaughn at a church social, and had decided within 20 minutes of their first conversation that she was going to marry him, a decision she had then spent the next 6 months making Gerald independently arrive at on his own. He told her about Indiana, about his father's woodlot and his mother's garden, and the way the morning fog came off the Ohio River on autumn mornings when he was young, and how he had left at 22 with the bone-deep restlessness that some people carry and that only distance seems to address, and how he had been addressing it ever since without ever quite being satisfied until recently. Until recently, she repeated. Until about 7 weeks ago, he said. Give or take a day. She looked at him with those warm brown eyes that had been watching him for weeks with a quality that had shifted from assessment to something else, and she said, "You are a considerable surprise, Frederick Sheridan." "I've been told I'm unremarkable," he said. "By people who weren't paying attention," she said, and the certainty in her voice made the words land somewhere permanent. On a Sunday in early July, after the morning church service in Caldwell that Henrietta and the family attended, and Frederick had joined for the first time, an event that produced considerable interested observation from the town, given that a single man choosing to sit in the Vaughn pew had a certain legibility in small community terms. They came home to find Thomas had convinced Silas to set up a proper croquet set that had been stored in the attic since Gerald's time. And the afternoon became a family game that drew in everyone, including Caleb, who initially watched from the porch with arms folded, and then, inevitably, came down to compete with the absolute seriousness of a man for whom winning a lawn game is a matter of genuine principle. Frederick played opposite Henrietta's team, which consisted of herself and Thomas, and they were formidable. Thomas had apparently been studying the angles, and when the game ended with Thomas's final shot going through the winning wicket with triumphant precision, the boy threw his mallet in the air and shouted something that Henrietta covered with a hand over her eyes, and the brothers laughed with the complete, authentic laughter of siblings. And Frederick stood in the summer afternoon with these people laughing and thought, "This is what I have been traveling toward this whole time, not a place, a life." He proposed to Henrietta Vaughn on the 1st of August, which was a Sunday afternoon and also happened to be Thomas's birthday. He had not planned it for Thomas's birthday. He had planned it for a quiet moment earlier in the week that had been disrupted by a fence emergency, and then a supply question, and then Elia's horse throwing a shoe at the worst possible moment, which is how he came to be standing in the barn doorway at 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, with Thomas's birthday cake being assembled in the kitchen by Henrietta, and a gift of a proper pocket watch that Frederick had bought in Caldwell waiting in the bunkhouse. And he thought, "It is now or it is never, and I have been waiting for the right moment for 3 weeks, and there is no such thing as a perfect moment. There is only the moment you are standing in." He had spoken to Caleb 2 days prior. That conversation had been shorter than expected. Caleb had listened with his jaw set and his eyes direct, and then he had said, "Do you intend to stay on this land, this specific land?" And Frederick had said yes. And Caleb had said, "Do you intend to earn your place in this family the same way you've earned everything else by working for it every day?" And Frederick had said yes. And Caleb had been quiet for a long moment and then had said, "Then you have my blessing, for what it's worth." It was worth a great deal, and both of them knew it. He found Henrietta coming out of the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder and the particular expression of a woman who is mentally tracking 6 things simultaneously and has arranged them in order of priority. She stopped when she saw his face. "What is it?" she said. "I need to say something to you," he said. "Before the birthday celebrations start, can you come sit with me for a minute?" She studied him. That studying look that had assessed him on the very first morning, and had continued to assess him every day since, updating its conclusions along the way. "Yes," she said, and hung the dish towel on the porch rail and sat in one of the porch chairs and looked at him with complete attention. He sat in the chair across from her. He was not nervous exactly. He was the feeling that is more than certainty, which is the feeling of knowing something is right the way your hands know the shape of a tool you have used for years. "I came to this property without any intention of staying," he said. "You know that. I was looking for work and a place to rest. And what I found was you, this family, this land." He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. "Henrietta, you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and I have watched you run this property and raise these sons and manage the accounts and fight for what belongs to you and split knotted wood in the afternoon heat and teach Thomas to see the stars. And every single day I have thought, I want to be the person who gets to stand beside this woman while she does all of those things." Henrietta's hands were still in her lap. Her brown eyes were very bright. "I am not a wealthy man," he said. "I have a horse and a bedroll and the skills of a working ranch hand and some small savings, and better than average judgment about fence posts and compound interest. I am asking if any of that is enough to make you want to build the rest of this with me." He paused. "Will you marry me, Henrietta Vaughn?" For a moment she did not say anything. The afternoon sat around them with all its summer weight and warmth. Then she said, "Frederick," and her voice had something in it that was not quite composed, which he had never heard before, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard in his life. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He reached across and took her hands in both of his, and she held on with the grip of a woman who has been carrying things alone for a long time and has just set them down in a place she trusts. And they sat together on the porch, while the Kansas afternoon went gold around them. Thomas found them approximately 4 minutes later, having apparently developed an instinct for significant moments, and looked between them with the acute observational precision of a 9-year-old who is very good at reading a room. "Did something happen?" he asked. "We have something to tell you," Henrietta said, and looked at Frederick. "Your mother has agreed to marry me," Frederick said. "If that is all right with you." Thomas Vaughn stood on the bottom porch step and considered this information with the gravity it deserved. 9 years old, the youngest, the one who did not fully remember his father, the one who had asked Frederick to teach him to rope and to name constellations, and who had told him with complete sincerity that he was a good example of how to be a person. "Are you going to stay?" Thomas said. "Not will you marry Mama, not will you live here, are you going to stay?" which was a different and more fundamental question. "Yes," Frederick said, "I am going to stay." Thomas looked at him for one more moment. Then he crossed the porch in 3 quick steps and threw himself against Frederick with the full-body confidence of a child who has decided something completely, and Frederick put his arms around the boy and held on. "Good," Thomas said, muffled against his shoulder. "I asked him before he could even think about leaving," he added to his mother, with the satisfaction of a person who has executed a plan successfully. Henrietta made a sound that was definitely a laugh and possibly also something else. The brothers' reactions, when told, followed each one's particular nature. Caleb nodded once with his arms at his sides, no longer folded, which was its own form of statement, and said "good luck" in a voice that was rough and meant something rather larger. Elias shook Frederick's hand with the directness and warmth of a man who has thought something through and arrived at a genuine conclusion. Silas said, in a rush, "Don't make a mess of it," and then seemed embarrassed by the directness of his feeling and left the room, and they could hear him outside talking to Thomas in a voice that was not entirely steady. They were married in September in the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a Saturday morning when the light was the particular gold of Kansas autumn, and the cottonwoods along the Chicaskia were turning color. And the service was attended by everyone in town who had been following the situation with the interested attention that small communities bring to these events. Henrietta wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a merchant in Wichita, a deep blue silk that matched her working-day cotton and shade, but was clearly, unmistakably, not a working-day dress. Her hair was up, with the auburn strands that always escaped contained for once, and she carried the small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Thomas had assembled that morning, with a concentration that had ruled out all other activity. Frederick wore his good suit, which he had purchased in Caldwell the week before because his existing suit, honestly examined, had not been adequate to the occasion, and stood at the front of the church with the complete calm of a man who has made the right decision and knows it. They were married by Reverend Hollies, who had been witnessing the situation develop with pastoral satisfaction, and who delivered the ceremony with an eloquence that surprised Frederick and clearly did not surprise Henrietta, who had known the man for years. When they walked out of the church into the autumn morning as Frederick and Henrietta Sheridan, Thomas immediately attached himself to Frederick's right side as though completing a circuit, and Caleb stood on the church steps and looked at his mother with an expression that had shed its armor entirely for one unguarded moment. And what was underneath was simply love, uncomplicated, filial, whole. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that Kansas winters are hard, cold, and uncompromising, with storms that came in off the plains without apology and demanded that the ranch be operated at full and careful attention. But it was also the most contented Frederick had been in memory, contented in the specific way of a person who has found the shape of a life that fits them properly. He and Henrietta worked the ranch together in the fullest sense of the word together. He brought skills she did not have, and she brought knowledge of the land and the operation that only years of living it could accumulate, and between them they were considerably more than either had been alone. The cattle came through the winter in good condition. The fences held. The accounts, which Frederick now shared in managing, showed a modest improvement that Henrietta said was better than any winter they had managed in the previous 3 years. In the evenings they sat by the kitchen stove, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply in each other's company in the productive silence that is one of the great gifts a good marriage gives you. Thomas did his schoolwork at the kitchen table and reported on his progress with the confidence of someone who expects his progress to be interesting to others, which it was. Caleb and Elias and Silas moved in and out with the natural rhythm of young men who are part of a household, but also beginning to exist beyond its edges. Caleb had started keeping company with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a development that had produced a transformation in his general affect that was remarkable to observe. Elias had begun taking on occasional work as a cattle appraiser for the county, a role that suited his particular combination of knowledge and quiet authority. Silas had decided he wanted to learn to be a farrier, a practical choice given how much shoe work the ranch's horses needed, and spent his evenings studying a manual on the subject with the dedication of a man who has finally found a direction. In the spring, Henrietta told Frederick she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before full light, when the kitchen was warm from the stove she had started and the rest of the house was still quiet. She stood across the kitchen table from him with her coffee cup in both hands and told him simply and directly, as she did all important things. He stood up from his chair and crossed to her and held her face in both his hands and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said, and her eyes were bright and entirely steady. "I am 41 years old and I am a woman who has done this before and I know the risks and I am not frightened. She paused. "I am profoundly glad." He was glad in a way that had no adequate language and that filled him from the ground up. He held her for a long while in the quiet kitchen with the day just beginning outside, and she held him back with the same specific certainty she brought to everything, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed saying. Thomas's response, when told, was characteristic. He said, "Good, because I have been waiting for someone younger to have to be responsible for," which made everyone laugh and produced from Silas the observation that Thomas was the most alarming 9-year-old he had ever encountered, to which Thomas responded that he was going to be 10 in August, and that was a significant difference. The summer moved toward its conclusion with the particular sweetness of a year that is going well. The cattle operation expanded slightly. They had purchased 6 additional breeding pairs in the spring with the savings from the winter, and the pasture conditions were strong enough to carry them. Caleb announced his engagement to the neighboring rancher's daughter, a composed and capable young woman named Marguerite, with the formal gravity of a man for whom the announcement of a major life decision is itself a major life decision. The family celebrated over one of Henrietta's best suppers, which was a notable achievement given the competition. Frederick and Caleb reached, over the course of that summer, something that was not quite friendship. They were too different in temperament for the easy companionship of friendship, but was a solid, reliable mutual respect that had warmth in it. Caleb called him Frederick now rather than Mr. Sheridan, which he had insisted on using through the spring as a kind of maintained formality. Frederick accepted this shift without comment, which was the correct response. In October, 2 weeks before the baby was expected, Frederick sat on the porch in the mild autumn evening and thought about his life. He thought about the road from Indiana to Kansas, about the years of moving and the years of not quite belonging anywhere, about the morning he had ridden into Caldwell and 3 men had warned him about the Vaughn widow. He thought about the gate opening and canteen walking through, and a woman with auburn hair and steady brown eyes looking at him from the porch with a patience that was not passive, but was the active patience of someone waiting to be shown a thing. He thought about Thomas throwing himself against him on the porch, asking, "Are you going to stay?" and how that question had been the most important question anyone had asked him in years. Thomas appeared beside him now, as Thomas often appeared, as though he operated on some frequency that detected when Frederick was thinking something worth interrupting. He was 10 years old now, had been since August, and was an inch taller and somewhat more philosophical about it than his younger self had been. He sat on the porch step and leaned back on his hands and looked at the same evening Frederick was looking at. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked. "About the baby?" "A little," Frederick said honestly. "Mama's not nervous," Thomas said. "I asked her." "I know," Frederick said. "She's braver than I am." Thomas considered this. "That's okay," he said. "You're better at fence posts," Frederick laughed. "That's true." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad I asked you to stay before you could leave. I could tell you were thinking about it." Frederick looked down at the boy with the curious sensation of a person being accurately seen by someone who has no reason to be paying that close attention. "I wasn't sure I was thinking about it," he said carefully. "You were," Thomas said, with the comfortable certainty of a child who trusts his own perceptions. "But then you stayed. And then everything was better." He said it simply, as though reporting the weather, the most straightforward accounting of a complicated matter. "That was good thinking on my part." "Exceptional thinking," Frederick agreed. Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Caleb says you're good for the ranch," he offered. "He said it to Elias. I heard him." "He didn't know I heard him." "Don't tell him you told me," Frederick said. "Obviously," said Thomas. Frederick's son was born on the 23rd of October, 1882, in the bedroom of the house that Gerald Vaughn had built and that Henrietta Vaughn had kept and that Frederick Sheridan had come to understand was the most real place he had ever stood. He was delivered by the doctor from Caldwell, who had been summoned with some urgency, given that the baby had decided to arrive rather ahead of the expected hour. And the process was several hours of the particular intensity that Frederick experienced largely from the hallway, where he kept Caleb company in the way of 2 men who are both somewhat at a loss and finding solidarity in being at a loss together. When the doctor opened the bedroom door and told him he had a son and that Henrietta was doing well, Frederick sat down on the hallway floor for a moment, which was not a considered action, and Caleb sat down beside him, which was also not a considered action, and they sat on the floor of the hallway of the house that Gerald Vaughn had built and breathed. "Well," Caleb said eventually. "Yes," Frederick said. "Congratulations, Frederick," Caleb said, and the use of the name had a quality it had not had before. "Thank you, Caleb," Frederick said, and that also had a quality it had not had before. Henrietta was sitting up in bed when Frederick came in, pale and magnificent, holding a small person with reddish-dark hair who was examining the world with the deep suspicion of someone new to the entire enterprise. She looked up when Frederick came in, and her face did the thing it did sometimes. The thing he had first seen when Thomas had successfully roped the fence post the unguarded total warmth that was purely hers. "Come and meet your son," she said. He came to the bed and sat on the edge and looked at the baby, who looked back at him with the same gray eyes Frederick saw in his own mirror every morning, and he felt the complete and impossible vastness of what a person can feel when their life has given them more than they expected. "What shall we name him?" Henrietta asked. "I was thinking," Frederick said carefully, "Gerald, if you'd agree to it." She was quiet for a moment, and her brown eyes went to some place in the middle distance, visiting something, and when they came back to him they were bright. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Gerald Frederick Sheridan. Gerald Frederick Sheridan," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the baby, Gerald Frederick Sheridan, 8 hours old and entirely unimpressed by the significance of his own arrival, made a small sound and went back to sleep. Thomas was allowed in 10 minutes later, formally, with the gravity of a brother being introduced to a sibling, and he looked at the baby with an expression of such absolute critical assessment that Frederick nearly laughed. "He's small," Thomas observed. "He'll grow," Henrietta said. "He doesn't do much," Thomas said. "Give him time," Frederick said. Thomas leaned down to look more closely, and the baby, perhaps disturbed by the scrutiny, opened his eyes and regarded Thomas with the same unfocused intensity he had turned on the world in general. Thomas looked back. Something seemed to pass between them. "Hello, Gerald," Thomas said, in a different voice than his usual one, quieter, with a gentleness in it that was entirely new. "I'm Thomas. I'll teach you things." The baby made a sound. "He agrees," Thomas told them with satisfaction. The years that followed were full in the way that a good life fills, with work and seasons, with difficulty and satisfaction, with the ordinary, extraordinary progression of people becoming more of who they are over time. The ranch grew steadily under Frederick and Henrietta's joint management. They added a second water source in the eastern acreage and expanded the herd to a size that required them to take on 2 regular hands, which meant Frederick had become the thing he had been hired to replace, a development he found deeply amusing. Caleb married Marguerite in the spring following Gerald's birth, and they built a house on the property's western edge that was close enough to the main house for family and far enough for the privacy of a new couple. It was a fine arrangement that suited everyone, and Marguerite proved to be entirely capable of holding her own among Vaughn personalities, which was not a skill to be underestimated. Elia's county work expanded, and by 1884 he was one of the more respected cattle appraisers in Sumner County, a fact that gave him quiet satisfaction and occasionally took him away from the ranch for weeks at a time. He eventually married a woman from Caldwell named Catherine, who was a school teacher and who regarded the entire Vaughn Sheridan enterprise with the affectionate anthropological curiosity of someone observing a fascinating social structure. Silas became an accomplished farrier, as he had intended, and set up a small operation in Caldwell that served the town and the surrounding ranches. He was, it turned out, genuinely gifted at it. He had his father's physical dexterity and his mother's patience, and he brought both to bear on the work, with the result that horses traveled from considerable distances to be shod by him. He remained bachelor for several years, living between Caldwell and the ranch with the easy freedom of a young man who has not yet been convinced that settling is better than moving. Frederick recognized the type and waited. Thomas grew up at the pace and in the manner of someone who had always known exactly what he was and needed only time to become more fully it. At 12, he was reading at a level that alarmed his teacher. At 14, He was doing the ranch accounts with a facility that made Henrietta step back from them with something approaching relief. At 16, he was managing significant portions of the ranch's business correspondence and had developed strong opinions about the cattle market that were, with some frequency, correct. He and Gerald, who arrived into full personhood at the kind of speed that tends to astonish people who think they have been paying attention, were the particular kind of brothers who are different enough to complement each other and similar enough to be genuinely close. Gerald had Frederick's gray eyes and Henrietta's practical intelligence, and a streak of absolute stubbornness that both parents recognized, from different sides of their own histories, as entirely their fault. By 1886, the ranch had expanded enough that they had sent 3 significant cattle drives to market, and the Sheridan-Vaughn name, they had settled on both, after a family conversation that had been characteristically direct, was known in the county for quality livestock and fair dealing. The eastern acreage that George Albright had tried to claim was producing well, a fact that gave Frederick a particular satisfaction every time he rode its fence line. He rode it now on a September morning in 1886, 4 years after the day he had ridden through the gate for the first time, Canteen moving at the easy pace of a horse that knew the ground. The property looked the way it looked when something has been properly cared for over time, not showy, not dramatically changed from what it was, but sound, settled right. He came back to the main house in the late morning to find Henrietta in the kitchen garden, doing the fall harvesting, her sleeves rolled up in her hair in that braid that always had strands escaping it, and Gerald running back and forth between her and the house on some commission that involved carrying bundles of herbs at a pace that suggested the commission was urgently time-sensitive, despite no particular urgency being visible to an outside observer. Henrietta looked up when she heard his horse and shielded her eyes with her forearm against the late morning sun and watched him dismount with the look she had been giving him for 4 years that still did the same thing to him it had always done. "Well," she called. "East fence is solid," he said. "The new posts the boys put in held through the summer." "Good," she said, and went back to her harvesting. He put Canteen in the barn and walked back to the garden and stood at the edge of it watching her work for a moment, watching Gerald pursue his commission with absolute dedication, watching the property move in the September breeze. "Henrietta," he said. She looked up. "This is the best thing that has ever happened to me," he said. He did not say it with particular ceremony. He said it the way he said all important things, plainly, with the full weight of meaning and not one word more. She looked at him, and she smiled, the real one, the one that had gotten into him on the porch that first summer morning when Thomas had successfully roped the post, the one that was entirely hers and had nothing performed about it. "For me as well," she said. "For me as well, Frederick." Gerald dropped his bundle of herbs at that moment and turned to his parents with the expression of a 4-year-old who has detected that something is happening and is determined to be part of it. He crossed the garden in his particular way, which involved a slight swerving path that was purely his own, and attached himself to Frederick's right leg with both arms and looked up. "Up," he said, a direct and efficient communication. Frederick picked him up and settled him on his hip, and Gerald looked around at the property from this elevated vantage point, with the satisfied expression of a small person who has correctly identified the best available position. Henrietta came to stand beside them, and Frederick put his free arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the easy rightness of years, and they stood in the September garden of the ranch that Gerald Vaughn had built, and Henrietta Vaughn had kept, and Frederick Sheridan had found his way to, on a fine Kansas morning with the sky blue all the way to the horizon, and the meadowlarks doing their particular business in the grass and everything exactly as it should be. Thomas came out of the house with the accounts book, because Thomas was 16 and the accounts book was his domain now, and stopped when he saw them and tilted his head with the observational precision he had been deploying since he was old enough to observe. "You're standing in the garden again," he said, to both of them, in the tone of someone who has noticed a recurring pattern. "Yes," Henrietta said. "Is this a standing-in-the-garden kind of morning?" "Every morning is a standing-in-the-garden kind of morning if you're paying attention," Frederick told him. Thomas considered this with the philosophical seriousness he brought to everything. Then he said, "That's a reasonable position," and came to join them, standing beside his mother in the September light with the accounts book under his arm, and his face turned up to the same sky they were all looking at. And the ranch went on through more seasons, through Caleb's first child born in the spring of 1887, a girl they named after Henrietta with Marguerite's cheerful permission, through Sela's eventually being convinced that settling was better than moving by a young woman from the neighboring county who was entirely unimpressed by his reserve, and whose lack of impressedness he found irresistible, through Thomas at 20 taking over the management of the ranch books, with a facility that freed Henrietta for the first time in years from the weight of the accounting, through Gerald growing into the gray-eyed, auburn-haired, entirely particular person he was becoming. Through all of it, Frederick Sheridan stayed. Through the hard winters and the good seasons, through the years of work and the evenings by the stove, through everything that a life on working land in Kansas in the late 19th century required, he stayed not because he had nowhere else to go, but because here was where he had always been meant to be, on a piece of ground alongside a woman who was the most extraordinary person he had ever known. With a family that had been built with 4 walls and a fence line and a great deal of hard work and the specific kind of love that is not dramatic but is entirely real, he was where he belonged. He was home. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the house was settled, and Henrietta sat across from him in the lamplight with her book and her coffee and the small sounds of the house around them, he would think of that September morning when she had asked him, "Are you going to stay?" and he had said yes. He had said yes. He had meant it the way a man means a thing he has finally understood. And the meadowlarks kept singing in the Kansas grass, and the fence posts held, and the land that Gerald Vaughn had built from nothing went on being tended by the hands that loved it, and everything that had needed to find its right place had found it.